Hi, everyone, and welcome as always to Thursdays with Troy. I'm Troy Lambert, super plotter, mystery author, and your host for today. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. This week, we're going to talk about handling multiple story arcs. Now, we're going to do it using the same platform we did last week. So, last week, I showed you basically a file of mine called Teaching Moments. So, let's review that really quickly. Okay, if you did tune into our last broadcast, or you're happy to watch this in order later on YouTube, you'll remember that this file actually looked a lot different. There were about 21 chapters, things like that. But since then, I've separated things out into beats as part of my rewriting process. I've also moved some of my timelines around, and I've done that on purpose so I can see them next to each other. Okay, so I have my main timeline, which is Max Boucher, who's my protagonist in this particular story. Underneath that, I have the template of the sleuth's journey, and I've put some things together in that template to make sure that my pacing is correct. Underneath, I've done a first-person confession that's a story that runs right alongside of Max's story throughout this book, and in the end, those two things tie together. Underneath that, I put the villain's journey, which is the plot template that I'm using for that particular plot. And underneath, I've got two different things. One's called the horse theft and one's called clues. And those are really just reminders to me of different things that I need to include in this particular book as I'm moving forward. Okay. And if you remember, if you haven't seen it yet, if you go and watch our broadcast on plot holes, we talked about using filtering and using the timeline to spot plot holes. Okay, so in that case, we look at our outline tab like this. Now you notice, obviously, this is very much longer than it was the last time. I've separated things out because I've separated out the two timelines until they intersect. And so I've separated this out into 58 beats instead of roughly 26 chapters or so. And they may end up, when I go to my final version, they may end up being chapters like this. But what I'm going to do in this outline case to spot plot holes is I'm going to isolate just one plot line at a time. So I know that this is my main protagonist plot. He appears in beat 2. And I can follow these notes all the way down, which I put some notes in here. Some I have not put notes in yet. But you'll notice that some of them are like this one. Beat number 8 is maybe cut this scene or shorten it. I may end up cutting it all together. The reason is it's a slow scene. It needs some revision. And I'm not sure that it fits in the book. I'm not sure it wasn't just one of those situations where I wrote a scene and I was telling myself the story, but the reader doesn't need to hear this part of it, right? So I can go down through all these different beats and make sure that Max's story makes sense. Now I'm going to show you in a minute a completely different way that I do this when I'm in the editing process. So when I'm in the editing and revision process, I have Plottr open on one screen and I have Microsoft Word open on the other because I write in Scrivener, I edit and revise in Microsoft Word. It's something that helps my brain to work better. It tricks my brain into knowing when I open Scrivener, we're writing creative fiction. So my muse shows up, she joins me, she does the things she's supposed to do. And then when we move on to Word, the more analytical part of my brain can turn on and I can look at revision and all those different things. Now you'll notice if you look closely over here that primarily Max is in these even beats. Okay, at first he starts out 3-5-7, but he's every other beat. Okay, he's not in every single beat. That's because I've moved the other plot line so that it is on every other beat. Okay, because then the two don't blend together until the very end of the story. Okay, so if you remember, I went through here, I looked for plot holes and made sure that all my scenes made sense. Even after last week's broadcast, I went through this more thoroughly. I rearranged some things. I moved some scenes around. Some of them I've already deleted even before I begin the revision process. Okay. And then I've done the exact same thing for now the first person story, the first person confession. I've gone through here and made sure that all of these things make sense, that they all happen in order, and that everything is where I want it to be. Okay, so to go backwards a little bit in background, this is a story. It took me way too long to write this book. I wrote several other books in the meantime. That's never a good idea. It always leaves you with kind of a mess. And so I have this book. It's called Teaching Moments. And I have my main detective, and I have a first person confession that goes along beside it. The two tie together at the end of the mystery. Now, what I've done on this timeline is, if you see the green squares, those are things that I've revised those scenes already. I've gone through, I've edited them, I've done my rewrites, I'm doing my first major revision of this story. And this is something I have to do quickly. I'm under deadline, all those different types of things, right? So I'm going through that part of it quickly. And I'm going to show you in a minute some other tags that I've added to this story, since we talked about plot holes, that are going to help me see different things that I might be missing. However, one of the things that I can filter by right away is I can filter by things that have been revised. And you'll notice that all my other stuff disappears. Now, as I go through further on this story, you'll see that those, obviously those revisions will get bigger. But if I revise things out of order, at least this tells me at a glance where I need to be, where I'm working on revision. And I can actually do the opposite too. Instead of filtering it by what needs to be, what it has been revised, I can do it by what needs to be revised. And I can look right away, and I'm only looking at the scenes and the things that I need to work with for revision. Okay, so that's one way that I can filter my timeline. Okay, but before I get to that, we're going to actually pop out of Plottr for just a minute, and I'm going to show you something else. I'm going to show you a couple of different Word documents, okay? And the reason I'm going to do that is I'm going to show you why I pull these things out the way that I do. So when you're dealing with multiple plot lines, in that case, each plot line needs to make sense on its own, right? So what you do when you're looking at different plot lines is you need to make sure that that plot line hangs together all by itself, right? So what I've done is, out of my Scrivener file where I write, I have pulled out all the files that are only related to Max and his story and put those in one document. Okay. Now, when I put those in that document, now, first of all, I've got my navigation pane open. If you're not familiar with this in Word, as I say very often when I do these things, this is something you should be familiar with. I've tagged all my chapters with certain headings, and I've also added in the scenes that are underneath that particular chapter that I'm working on. Okay, and so I've set this all up so I have all of this plot line in one Word document. Now I can read through it without reading through the other part of the story that runs parallel to it, and to make sure that it actually fits and it actually works. Okay, so I've done the exact same thing with the other Word file that is essentially for my other antagonist. So I've pulled out all the first person confession, and I've pulled that into its own document as well. Okay. And so I can look through that document and make sure that I'm looking at everything that I need to look at with Nikki, who's the one that's the first person confession. Now, the key is that the reader doesn't know who this is throughout the book until almost the very end, unless they're very astute readers, and there's one point where it keeps it, where it basically gives it away. Okay, so I have things to keep in mind here, keeping the identity secret, making a compelling story arc, because what this ends up being is several different short stories of different people that she's killed along the way. Okay, so not to go too deep into that, but what I've done is I pulled them both out into Word documents so I can edit them and have Plottr open in a separate window, and without looking at the other part, so I don't get distracted. So you'll notice when you look at the timeline in Plottr again in a minute that I've started and I've gotten ahead on the max timeline for revisions, and I'll go back and revise a couple of the scenes that are related to the first person confession, right? But I keep those two separate so I don't confuse any details, so I don't mix the story. Essentially, is I make sure that this story is going to work the way it's supposed to by doing that. Okay, so that's tip number one, is I pull these Word documents out into two entirely separate Word documents. I have Plottr open on the other screen. Now, what am I doing in Plottr on that other screen? Well, I'm going to show you exactly what I'm doing in Plottr on that other screen, and I'm going to show you how this works for me. Now, different people do this differently, so there's no right and wrong answer, but I'm going to show you a couple really key tags that I'd look at here. Okay, so we're going to take a look again into this Plottr file. I showed you already that I've looked at the outline, right? And in each of these also, I put tons of characters, even minor characters are included in here, and I've tagged them in each scene. That's the way I can make sure that the character runs through the way they're supposed to, so I can actually filter by character later on as well. The other thing I've done is I've added places, even minor places in the story, so that I've got a setting for each place that I go to. And as I go along in those, I'm actually adding a little bit of description and some pictures as I come to each one of those, and I need to picture them more clearly in my revision process. I tend to underwrite description and add description and cut fat as I go through the revision process. That's just my process. Some people tend to over describe in their initial first draft and then cut that down. It really depends on how you work as a writer, but that's what I do. Okay, so I've got all these different places. I basically only tagged them by this one book, and I haven't added these other tags to them yet because these are the tags that I have set up. And I showed you these last week, but I'm going to show you to them in more detail. I already showed you needs revision and revised, and then I have a check stage system where I send things to beta readers or to people that I'm writing partners, things like that. But the most important of these for our discussion today in managing multiple plot lines is I've added high, medium, and slow as action levels. Now, you could probably add several action levels in here, depending upon how you wanted to do that. But what I'm going to do with this is to see if these action levels run kind of anti-parallel to each other, that if there's a slow point in the B story, that there's a high point in the A story, so it keeps the reader engaged and keeps them reading along. Well, now what I'm going to show you is, I'm going to be very open about this, is that I have some failures in the way that I wrote this book initially. In fact, you'll see as we look further along here that there are some of these that I've looked inside this and said, maybe cut this scene or shorten. Others of them, I've clicked inside them and just said, make this more action-packed. This is basically boring. You need to work on this. Okay, but how do I get an overall picture of this? Well, there's one thing is, like, I normally am scrolled this close into Plottr so I can look at each individual scene card. As I'm working through revisions, I'll be going through that scene card and I'll be adding some notes for myself. I'll be making sure I have all the tags correct and all that kind of stuff for when I come back later in my final revision, my final edit walkthrough of this before it goes to a copy editor, right? So I go through this and add notes to it and things like that. But when I want to look at the overall picture, I zoom out. Now, I can zoom out to medium, but I still can't quite see all of this because there's so many beats in it. So I'm going to take the zoom level out as far as it goes. Now, if you haven't looked at this particular thing with Plottr before, you can hover over these scenes and still see what's inside and even click inside them and modify it. It's just that they turn into little dots at this level instead of being the full scene cards. They're still colored the same, They're still stacked the same. You can see where I've got 3 in a single chapter or single beat in this particular case. Okay, but the beauty is right here, I can filter the way that I did before. Well, my filters under tags for action are high, medium, and slow. So the first thing I want to look at is go, oh my goodness, where are my slow chapters? And I'm like, oh man, I have a couple slow chapters, a couple slow beats right at the beginning with both different storylines. One with my main storyline, there's a few slow chapters there. One with my first person confession storyline, there's a couple slow chapters there. And then we can see some other ones that I've sprinkled throughout here. And what my goal is to take these slow chapters and to at least make them have kind of what I would consider a medium action level, and make sure that even if they're slow, they have a really strong hook into the next story. So in this particular case, I can see right here, I've got a slow paced storyline here of the wake up call. And I've also got a slow part where our killer actually meets one of her victims, right? And it's a slow introduction to that. You'll notice with both of those that I've stacked them, though, with a medium scene, so I can blend these two scenes together, shorten up some of the fat that's in these two scenes, and make them more of that medium action level to get rid of 2 slow scenes in a row. In fact, 1, 2, 3 in a row, which is one of the first things that I noticed when I filtered this. I'm like, oh my goodness, I've got 3 slow scenes in a row. That's going to be a disaster for my reader. They're going to get bored and they may leave the book at that particular point, and I don't want that to happen. Now, when I filter them again, I'm going to filter by the medium paced scenes. So I'm going to go, okay, well, I have quite a few of those paced, but there's quite a few of those together right here. And if I bring all of my scenes up to a medium kind of action level, well, then a whole bunch of mediums in a row is actually pretty slow. I need to put some peaks in there, some higher action, higher tension peaks. That's what you can think of this as too, is tension and conflict that's higher. Okay, so I'm going to filter through these different action things and see where I have slow, medium, and high action. So the next one, of course, the last one I'm going to do is the high action. Now, I haven't revised most of these scenes yet, but I'm looking at, I start out with a bang, I have a dip, I have another high, couple dips, another high. So there's some things I need to massage and fix in here to make sure that I'm taking the reader on the correct journey. And you can almost see a pattern here, almost see a path here throughout the book of the way that I wrote it. And you can see that there's a little bit of the sagging middle where there's medium and there's only a couple high points in the middle of the book. And I need to go back and address that and fix that and add some higher action and add some conflict, especially because of the type of book this is. This is a serial killer, thriller, mystery. There's lots of death and stuff like that. This stuff should be exciting, but the mistake I made is my sleuth in here is grabbing a whole bunch of clues. Okay, so I need to add high action there. I've added a ticking clock there. I need to add more action and ramp this up to medium at least. I'm adding an additional suspect. So I've gone through and added all these notes to myself in these different scenes about the things that I need to do to ramp up the action. Okay, so that's the action part of these story arcs. Now, the other part that I need to keep track of, actually, for me in a mystery situation, is the clues. So down here, I haven't added a lot of tags to the clues yet, but I need to look through all these clues and make sure that the clues fit in with the story arc so I can solve both mysteries at once. So it's kind of a tricky thing, the way I'm having to add clues into here. I've got a horse theft, I've got a murder, and both those things are connected by one person and basically one set of actions. And so I need to make sure that I follow through those things and close up all those different story loops and all those different clues. So every one of the clues that I find here, I have to resolve them right down at this end part of the story here. Okay, so this is one of the ways that I do that. Now we're going to pop back out to my normal viewpoint and to the beginning of the story. Because the other thing I'm going to do when I come in here in the start is I'm going to revisit what I call goal, motivation, conflict, and verb. And I've also added the action level here along with the tag. Okay, so what I've done is I always go through and I make sure each scene has a goal, motivation, and conflict. When I run across a scene that doesn't have one of these, I look at either a way that I can add it, or I look at whether I need that scene at all. And maybe it just needs to be cut out entirely. My verb is sometimes more of a feeling than a verb. It's how I want the reader to feel at the end of this chapter. I want the reader to feel pretty breathless at the end of this chapter. I want them to realize that Max has just ended one case and he's embarking on another rather stressful journey fairly quickly. And that's because he really doesn't have any choice in the matter. This is just the way things are going to work for him. Okay. Basically, I revisit this for every single scene that I've written. So through this revision process, basically, when you're handling multiple story arcs, you've got to keep the two of them separate. So there's goal, motivation, and conflict in every single one of them. So we see what I've done with Max here, and then we go back to the first person confession, and I haven't actually filled in the goal, motivation, and conflict yet, or much of a description. I just revised that one, mainly because it was pretty polished. But I've added these things into different scenes that I've revised that basically say, okay, this is what's going on here. This is what needs to happen, and this is why it's happening. This is why I need to pay attention to this. So this is early in my revision process with multiple storylines. So let's look at the other things that you can do. Okay, so you can filter by all of these different things, by all of these different characters, right? And all of these different places. So I can see that this particular place is only involved in really one of the mysteries that involves the serial killer. So I just make sure I haven't put this in any weird places before I continue on with my story. Okay, so you can filter by places and things like that, but you can pull out these two things. Now, another thing that I'll do sometime that I'm going to show you is I'll move this up above both templates so that essentially I'm putting both of these stories next to each other. So I can see this is high action, high action. I can see all those things by just hovering over those. And I can see that this is a period of kind of slow action in this particular one. And then it moves to a medium here. And that's why I'm like, okay, I'm going to combine these two scenes. Okay. Then the final goes back to a high action instead. This is a revisiting of the murder scene, so it goes down to medium. Okay. So I'll put these two next to each other once I finish with more of the revision process and make sure I'm looking at the journey and how these two things actually work well together and how they work in parallel. Okay. Now, if you have more plot lines than this, let's say you're writing an epic fantasy or epic sci-fi and you have several plot lines, I would recommend that you do exactly the same thing, that you go into your outline section and that you filter by each one of those plot lines one at a time. I could filter by this horse theft and make sure that I put all the elements in here that I need to happen in that particular one. I'll uncheck that first person. Or I can do the same thing with clues and say, okay, at the end, I can go through just this clues section and make sure that I have included the wrap up to every single one of these clues, either as a wrong turn. So it's been resolved because it was a wrong clue, it was a false clue, it was a red herring, and we've discovered that, or that it's one of the genuine clues. And I've made sure that when I get down to the final solution, down here, the final resolution of both crimes and the wrap up of clues, that I have wrapped up all of these clues so far that I haven't left any loose ends. Okay, so you can do the same thing with any plot line that you have, is you filter by one at a time, and you just make sure that everything works in that particular plot line. If you pull them apart into separate documents, that's even better. Now, there's a way you can do this that I'm going to show you really quick, which is another method of doing this. When you do an advanced export, let's say you're going to go into Scrivener, I can choose which plot lines I want to appear. So I can say, well, I only want Max's plot line. And I could actually write it in a different Scrivener file. Now, I don't do that. Or you could transfer your stuff over from one Scrivener file to another, which is actually really easy to do. And so you could look just at his in Scrivener. Now, typically I do it in Word instead, but you can do the exact same thing. I can say, I only want this plot line. I can export that, enter in my text from that particular plot line, and then I can see how it all works together. And that's exactly how I get those different Word files. Okay, so that's a way that you can export things in just those sections and look at those just one at a time. So with that, thanks everybody. I hope this has been really informative to you. This is kind of a continuation of what we did last week. We talked about avoiding plot holes. This week we talked more about just what parallel storylines look like, what parallel story arcs look like, and how to manage them when you're going through that whole rewriting process. I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope that it's given you some ideas that you might be able to add into your own process. And with that, thanks for joining me, everyone. I appreciate it. And we'll see you next week on Thursdays with Troy. Thanks.